Okay, so in the last lecture we talked about fixed and variable costs. In this lecture we're going to talk about another way of dividing up costs into implicit costs and explicit costs. So explicit costs are what people really think about when they think about costs mostly. And so these are things that involve payments with money. And the payment, when we say money, we don't just mean cash. It doesn't mean you have to pay, get out your nickels and dimes and pay for whatever it is. This is cash, but you can also pay in other ways. It involves money, but you might pay by check, you might pay by money transfer between banks, you might pay with a credit card, but we'll count these as all cost payments. It's money going out from the firm to somebody else, and it's real money that's being paid. So these are kind of the things you would think about. You know, wages. You have to pay your workers, and you have to pay them in money. If you don't pay them, they're not going to show up for work. Your landlord. You can't just pay him promises. You need to pay him actual rent. Your utility companies. If you don't pay them, they're going to cut you off. Things like when you purchase raw materials, or you pay interest to your firm's bondholders and banks. Real money is leaving the firm, and so we'd classify these as explicit costs. Implicit costs are costs that do not involve monetary payments, but they represent the use of factors that have economic value. So this is a kind of a slightly harder concept to get, but the kind of thing to think about is, and we'll talk more about these, the value of the owner's time, normal return on equity, rent that the firm could receive on property it owns. So let's start with the opportunity cost of the owner's time. This can be an important implicit cost, and the reason it's an implicit cost, not an explicit cost, is many owners pay themselves less than the value of your firm. So especially if you start up a new business, you'll often find yourselves with cash flow problems at the beginning, and the easiest person not to pay anything to is yourself, the owner of the firm. So if you don't pay your workers, they won't show up for work anymore, but if you don't pay yourself, it doesn't matter, because hopefully your business will be successful and you'll be able to make it up to yourself later. So many owners pay themselves less than the value of their time. But this is a real resource that you're using up. If you work at your business, this is time. Your time is valuable, and you could be doing other things with it. You could be earning money at a salaried job. Maybe you could just be enjoying yourself, retiring and sitting by the pool every day or playing golf every day. But you're giving up something to work at the firm. And so your time's valuable, and we want to take that into account whether or not you pay yourself a salary out of it. So the way to think about it is this is an opportunity cost, and the way we'd think about it is of the owner's time is the best alternative use of the owner's time. What is that worth? The way we'd often calculate this would be through lost wages from another job. So let's imagine an example. We've got Miss Garcia. She owns a business, starts her own business. She's quit a job as an attorney. She was working for another firm, and now she started her own law business. And her old attorney job paid her $100,000 per year. Now, initially, she doesn't pay herself any money because she needs to bring in clients and at first. So her new business doesn't pay her anything initially. So there are no explicit costs here. There's no money going out from the business to her. So from the firm's viewpoint, there's no explicit costs. No money is leaving the firm. But Miss Garcia's time is still worth something. And one reasonable way to value it would be the opportunity cost of her time, which is the next best use of her time, which is probably to keep her old job. So her time's worth $100,000 per year. So the implicit cost in this example is $100,000. It's $100,000 that she would have got from being an attorney that she's not getting because she quit her job to start her own business. That would be the implicit cost. We can imagine that maybe she doesn't pay herself nothing. Maybe she pays herself $50,000, which is worth less than the value of her time. So here the firm does have explicit costs. It has $50,000 of explicit costs. $50,000 goes from the firm's bank account into Miss Garcia's personal bank account. But that's not what her time is worth. Her time's worth $100,000 a year. So there's also an implicit cost in this case, and it's $50,000, which is the $100,000 her time is worth, the opportunity cost minus $50,000 she's paying herself. So note that in both cases the total costs are the same. They're both $100,000. So in the first case it's $50,000. In the first case it's $100,000 of implicit costs and no explicit costs. The second case it's $50,000 of explicit costs plus $50,000 of implicit costs. So the costs are the same in both cases. So time was worth $100,000 in both cases, whether she pays herself something or nothing. Okay, so along these lines we can think of another implicit cost, and that's the use of resources that the firm owns. So let's imagine that you're an old firm and you built your factory 100 years ago, and at the time you had bank loans and you had debts that you had to pay off, and but you paid all those off now. So you're not renting the building, you own it, and you don't pay yourself any rent, of course. The firm doesn't pay itself rent for using it. So there's no explicit costs here. There's no money leaving the firm because of their using this building. But the opportunity cost of using this building is not zero. And the reason it's not zero is if the firm did not use this building, it could rent it out to somebody else who would use it. So that lost rent that they get, they don't get because they're using the building themselves, is the opportunity cost of doing it. So this is going to be an implicit cost, and the way we'd probably measure the implicit cost is the value of the lost rent in this case. So if you could have rented that building for $10,000 a year, then the implicit cost would be $10,000 if the firm's not paying rent to use its own building. And you could use a similar approach for machinery and equipment that the firm uses. So maybe you bought a truck 20 years ago and you paid off the lease for it now, but you're still using a valuable resource because you could sell it or lease it to somebody else if you weren't using it. And as we said, a value of the owner's time if the owner's not paid a salary. The final implicit cost we want to think about is a fair return on equity and a normal rate of return on equity. So equity is the money that the owner has invested in the company. So when you start up a business, you often need to put down some of your own money to pay for things. When you start up, you don't have any income, any revenue. So if you want to pay for things that like buying buildings and buying equipment, you need to pay for it somehow. And the way you often do it, it's difficult to get bank loans as a new business. It's difficult to get other people to give you money that you can use. So often you put your own money into the firm, and this is the equity that you have in it. The equity might be belonged by somebody else. So you might get $100,000 from your rich uncle, not as a loan, but for an ownership share in the firm. Now, if the owner didn't take that $100,000 and didn't invest in the company, he could do something else with it. So one thing he might do is he could buy a house and rent it out. He might invest it in the stock. He or she might invest it in the stock market. He or she might buy government bonds or CDs, or he or she might invest it in another company. Or maybe he or she doesn't even want to invest at all. They just want to use that money to have fun. So they're going to use that $100,000 and travel the world and have a great time for a year. But because it's been invested in the firm, you can't use it for these things. And so there's an opportunity cost to putting your equity into the firm. And so we need to take this into account when calculating the implicit cost. We want to know what the opportunity cost of the owner's equity is. So we need to know what the best alternative use of the owner's equity is. So we need to know what return the owner would get from the best other investment they might make. Now, when we're doing this, we need to be a little bit careful because some investments are riskier than others. So a fair return on capital is going to be higher for risky investments than for lower investments. So you need to have the alternative investment to be about as risky as the original investment. So, for example, if you're investing in a restaurant and you know there's a good chance it's going to go under in the first 6 months, say, of the time you do it, and sadly, restaurants really do have a high failure rate. They turn around quite quickly. There have been a couple of buildings near where I live where there's been 2 or 3 restaurants in there over the past 5-10 years. So restaurants turn over quickly, and so it's a risky investment putting your money into a restaurant. So you wouldn't want to take, say, the fair return of investing in government bonds, which you know is a much safer investment. So you'd want something about equally risky as your original investment. Okay, so we've now broken down costs in 2 ways, into fixed and variable costs and into explicit and implicit costs. One thing about this, as I should say, is there's no overlap between the two. You can have fixed costs that are explicit costs, fixed costs that are implicit costs, variable costs that are explicit costs, variable costs that are implicit costs. So in this sense, there's no fixed relationship between fixed costs and variable costs and explicit costs and implicit costs. They're like two different ways of dividing up this the total costs, but unfortunately there's not it's not, you can say, all implicit costs are variable costs or all explicit costs are fixed costs, because it's not true. Okay, so in the next mini lecture we're going to talk about accounting profits versus economic profits.